So I want to take a moment to appreciate and highlight two features of the similarity probability view that I think are important, and I want to articulate them, I hope at least, uh, clearly so that you can see their significance. So on the one hand, prototype, and we'll see exemplar theories as well, the structure of a concept or a category is inherently vague. That is, there are definitive clear-cut applications of prototypical instances of the concept, instances that share all of the properties associated with the prototype. They're easy to identify and they're quickly identified. As one moves away from those more prototypical instances, however, the application of the concept becomes increasingly less definitive, more subjective, right? And so you start to see that people differ between each other as to the application of that concept. You start to see that they may even differ in their judgments from one instance to the next, one context to the next. So, for example, my dad and I would differ about the nature of beanbags. For me, a beanbag, and I had one when I was a kid, was a chair. It was a beanbag chair. But for my dad, it was a pillow on steroids, maybe. It was something that just sat on the floor. It wasn't a chair. And our concepts of chair, like the concept of door that we talked about in the last module, have that structure to them. All right. So you're probably sitting on a chair right now, and it's probably a pretty typical chair. It has a resting place for your rear. It's got a number of legs to support you. It maybe has a back. All right. All of those things are typical features of chairs that make them pretty prototypical. When we start to move away from those things that don't have those sorts of features. So if we say we start talking about a bar stool, it has no back and it only has a single leg in the center, right? Well, that's still a chair. It's very atypical, right? It's tall, it's taller than the usual chair and so on, but we can still recognize it fairly easily as a chair. As we start to move farther away, when we start to get to things like beanbags that don't have one uniform surface, that don't have a set of supports, that don't differentiate between the seat and the back, those things are much vaguer. They're much less definitive of being a chair, but we can still come up with a categorization when we need to. And being able to come up with a categorization as opposed to not having an answer is crucially important. Coming up with a categorization allows you to access knowledge, allows you to have some chance at coming up with an appropriate adaptive response. Whereas if you don't categorize something, then you don't have that chance at all. And one of the interesting things about more classical approaches to categorization is they're very brittle. If you come up with a rule for categorizing something and there's just one little difference, the system won't categorize it. And what we want is something that can recognize all the variations and complexities in our experience and help us to handle them, to be able to categorize and to formulate adaptive responses to them. And so typicality tells us that concepts have this inherent vagueness. That is, this vagueness allows for a certain flexibility in how we categorize the world. We can categorize prototypical instances very quickly. Once we start to move away from those prototypical instances to less definitive cases, right, then we have a harder time, but we can still categorize if we have to. We recognize the difference in those two cases in terms of the confidence that we have, how typical we do it, how quickly we do it, and so on. And similarly, the task of categorization with limited knowledge also proves inherently ambiguous, both because our concepts are ambiguous between instances of them, and because objects are ambiguous with respect to our categories and concepts. So you can think about categorization as kind of a management of ambiguity. Categorization decreases unhelpful ambiguity by providing us with access to generalized knowledge for a class of things, but it does so at the cost of a loss of specific information, increased ambiguity. So take that case of a watermelon. That watermelon is an ambiguous object with respect to our categorizations and concepts. We could categorize it as green. We could conceptualize it as an oval. It has a bit of plant matter, as a fruit, as a piece of food, right? all of these categorizations are applicable to the same object, and hence the object is conceptually ambiguous. When we categorize it, say as a piece of fruit, we decrease the ambiguity inherent in that object, allowing us to access information and giving us a chance to formulate an adaptive response to the situation. But in doing so, we also introduce another kind of ambiguity because our concepts don't differentiate between instances of them. So the watermelon, when thought of as a fruit, is a fruit in the same way that the apple, when thought of as a fruit, is a fruit. And so we don't differentiate between the individual instances of the category when we think of the object qua category. So we introduce a certain amount of ambiguity, but this ambiguity isn't detrimental to our solving the problem. In fact, it's useful. It's because we can think of this object in terms of this general category that we're able to amass a set of information that is likely to be useful in our adaptive responses. So this trade-off between a loss of individual detail and increasing ambiguity with regard to the specifics of that object, and a gain of generalized knowledge, a decreasing of ambiguity with regard to the object itself as an instance of something, that drives categorization. And it makes sense given human inference and decision-making needs. Decreasing individual detail helps the brain to manage that huge volume of sensory information, increasing speed, as well as conserving processing and memory resources. Moreover, that individual detail can be recovered perceptually. We can use the world, in effect, as a memory, so that if we need particular details about the object, we can go back and look at it again and recover those details. Likewise, categorization allows cognizers to access information about objects that goes beyond immediate experience, that can't be discovered perceptually just by looking at the object necessarily. So a cup is used to hold liquids for drinking. That's not something that's just manifestly obvious when you look at a cup. So again, this relationship between decreasing the ambiguity inherent in the objects with regard to our categories by introducing a new ambiguity, an ambiguity between different instances of the same category, this turns out to be a very beneficial, on the whole, trade-off for us, a good management of ambiguity through the use of conceptualization and categorization.